vibe as world-making, art as the distillation of vibe, and ML theory as philosophy of art. So, Wilfrid Sellers, the second best philosopher to die from drinking poison, said we have two images of ourselves. The first is the manifest image, where we're something like what court proceedings in a liberal democracy must take us for. We act, we reason, we fail to reason, we fail to act, we form habits, we speak our minds, we lie, we speak sense or speak nonsense, we know ourselves a little or a lot, we learn rules, we make judgments, we understand statements or fail to understand statements. The second image is the scientific image. In the scientific image, we are whatever can explain why the manifest image even works at all. We are the secrets of how networks of electrochemical pulsations make an animal whose world-making, life-making, meaning-making games will halfway hold together. My book tries asking what place we can find for a third image, which one might call the poetic image or poetry with a capital P. I don't mean poems necessarily by poetry, but rather a world image born of art's resentment over getting cut out of the deal between the manifest and scientific image. Poetry, as we'll have it, was invented sometime in the 1820s when the poet and world historical icon Percy Bysshe Shelley couldn't shake a friend's half-joking argument about the uselessness of poets in an age of scientists and statesmen. Excited to a sacred rage, as he says, Shelley wrote the treatise A Defense of Poetry, where he proposed kind of radical new theory about the human animal's capacity to build sustainable worlds, sustainable lives, and sustainable meanings. We have, Shelley says, for all the defects of our nature, a good ear for what clicks. The selves, ideas, relationships, cultures, and sciences that we build hold by the grace of a kind of clicking of mind, language, and nature. There is an onto somethingness, a resonance, a pleasurable hint of an unspeakable coherence, maybe leading up to the eternal triangle of the good, of the true, the beautiful, and the just. And for Shelley, art and poetry especially is partial speech of this unspeakable coherence. It speaks this unspeakable coherence in whatever capacity in which it can be spoken or quasi-spoken. My project in my book is to try and build an account of how the aesthetic unity or the vibe of an artistic work can grasp the sort of causal material coherence or causal material foundation of clicking of a given life world. A life world could be, the life world of like a person, the life world of a city, the life world of a culture, the life world of an era, the life world of a family, the life world of like a community or a practice or a tradition. So the basic idea, at most literal, is that the cognitive content of a literary work or any work of art lies partly in a kind of aesthetic vibe that we can sense when we consider all the myriad objects or phenomena that make up the imaginative landscape of the work as a kind of curated set of stuff and things and events and happenings that belong together, that go together in the first instance, ineffable sense, maybe effable upon reflection, but certainly not effable to begin with. So, for example, we said the meaning of Dante's Inferno, for example, lies in part in the je ne sais quoi that makes every soul, demon, and machine in Dante's vision of hell a good, right fit for Dante's vision of hell. And I argue in my work that in many cases, if we think of this aesthetic unity within a work of art as a kind of distillation of a looser, weaker, more diffuse aesthetic unity about the objects or phenomena of a real-world domain. And therefore, we can think of the strong aesthetic unity of the work of art as a kind of structural representation of an underlying structure that reveals itself in the real world through the weaker, looser aesthetic unity that's experienced in actual life. So you might say that the dense vibe of a work of art is a kind of blueprint for cognizing an endemic loose vibe in the actual life world. And further, might say that the alignment of the dense vibe and the loose vibe acts as a kind of axis for projecting the artwork's internal structural logic into the world, turning the grammar or sort of like internal gestalt logic of the work of art into a schema for interpreting the life world's object and phenomena. I'm going to skip a tiny bit. Okay, so I'm going to try and give like an intuitive illustration of this idea and then give a slightly more technical account of how I think we can use like ML theory to talk about how this is possible and how this could work as a real concrete thing in the world. So for my intuitive illustration, I'm going to hope you'll recall with me a type of mathematical visual art project from the heyday of 1990s hacker culture known as a 64K intro. In the artistic mathematical subculture known as demoscene, a 64K intro is a lush, vast, and nuanced visual world that fits into 64 kilobytes of memory or fewer, which is less memory by 1,000-fold than the standard memory requirements for building a lush, vast, and nuanced visual world. In a 64K intro, 100 or so lines of code create a centrally complicated universe by, using the sort of like, I'm here quoting a line from the Symbolist Manifesto, using the esoteric affinities of surfaces with primordial ideals. So, the code of a 64K intro is the smallest possible inventory of initial schemata to generate the most diverse concreta. And the information magic behind the 64K intro is that somewhat like a spatial fugue, the world of a 64K intro is a tapestry of interrelated self-similar patterns, from sort of like topological level of architecture and camera movement to the molecular level of like the polygons and textures from which objects are built. Everything in a 64K intro is born of a family resemblance of forms. So the story that I tell in my work about vibe focuses on a type of AI operation called autoencoding, where a learning algorithm treats the real world as a little bit akin to a 64K intro. An autoencoder is an artificial neural network tasked with learning to make facsimiles through a compression bottleneck. An autoencoder has to translate each input that it's given into a short code and then approximately reconstruct the input from the short code. The point of this training task that we give to the autoencoder is for the neural network to learn how to leverage rich recursive patterns that structure its training data, developing a kind of gestalt fluency that models its training data like a niche or a life world. It models sort of like the totality of the training set as like a world of interrelated objects that hinge on sort of a common underlying generative structure. The eventual outcome of this training process, the autoencoder model learned by the autoencoding learning algorithm, is a kind of recipe book for the objects of the training domain. And if all goes well, these recipes act as intelligent representations of their objects and collectively make up a kind of map of the training domain. Now, needless to say, the real world isn't a 64K intro, so the short codes that an autoencoder learns do not construct true recreations of their target objects. They instead construct idealized approximations. If somebody could bring me a glass of water, that would be tremendous help. So instead of exactly recreating the target objects, autoencoders in effect replace the target object with an object from a kind of 64K intro that the autoencoder built to replace the real world with. So, what an autoencoder does in the end is that it takes in the world, it learns how to leverage certain structural principles to construct a kind of idealized, simplified version of the world, and then when it encounters a thing in the world, it replaces the thing in the world with its idealized approximation, and then calls Stolt its recipe book for the construction of the idealized approximation to receive structural insight into the nature and logic and systemic understructure of the object. Now, I'm especially interested in the sort of collection of idealized imaginary 64K intro-like objects that an autoencoder constructs and replaces the real-world object with. This like menagerie of like idealized hypercompressible objects, mathematically speaking, the image of the trade autoencoders function, and its relationship to the autoencoder's understanding or interpretation of its inputs and its training set, I think has a powerful like relationship to what we might think of like intuitively in humanities term as the relationship between a worldview, a mood, a method of like mimesis, and the intrinsic unity or integrity of a world, of a material world constructed under a certain cultural logic. Previewing very quickly some technical ideas motivating this, there are 4 things that are really interesting about this like set of 64K intro-like facsimiles. One is the set of all the inputs that the trade to encoder net can compress with 0 loss. That is to say, if you feed this idealized object the autoencoder made up to the autoencoder, it's going to be able to recreate them without any error at all. It sees them with complete clarity and complete correctness, whereas it sees everything else only, approximately and inaccurately as mediated by these imaginary objects. So like 2 is like kind of what I already said. It's all input reconstructions by the trained autoencoder will replace the original input with an element of the 64K intro-like set. 3 is the fact that like when we look at the set of all these reconstructed objects, we can think of them together as exemplifying kind of like high fidelity simplification of the objects generated by the world. That is to say, taken together, all these like objects express a certain kind of like interpretive paradigm applied to the real world. And finally, and this one is like an original mathematical observation I did in my PhD work with the help of my mathematician advisor, Tomer Schlank. If we train a fresh untrained autoencoder on samples from the idealized world created by a trained autoencoder, the fresh autoencoder is going to converge to the trained autoencoder like very fast. That is to say that you can learn a way of seeing very quickly by examining or immersing yourself in a set of imaginary or constructed like object that this way of seeing sees most clearly. And that's really sort of like the central idea of the work, that there's a deep relationship between a system of abstractions that we use to navigate the world and a kind of canonical set of imaginary or constructed objects that this way of seeing is ideally suited for, or for which this way of seeing is a lossless way of seeing rather than like a lossy way of seeing. And by sort of like closely examining in an immersive way the objects such that a certain way of seeing is lossless for them, we can come to acquire and understand and grasp the way of seeing itself. I probably went over time already, so thank you so much.